Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business by Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years leading debates about responsible business inside the European Parliament, I host our discussions of the latest developments in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, is there a case for degrowth? Many of our listeners will immediately recall from the very idea, but a growing number of academics and others are advocating the theory. And this edition of Frankly Speaking will allow the argument to be aired and see how some of the main counter-arguments are answered. My guest to talk us through all of this is Matt Orsagh, co-founder of the Arketa Institute for Post-Growth Finance, who for nearly 20 years was Senior Director Capital Markets at the CFA Institute, the body which trains and represents investment professionals worldwide. Matt, welcome to Frankly Speaking.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Now, let's start by talking through your personal journey. At the CFA Institute, you were informing the investment community about ESG and sustainability issues, but in a context where the underlying assumption was that successful investment actually leads to growth. Why did you start to change your mind about that? And what was the process going on in your own thinking which led you to the argument for degrowth?
Right. Well, I'll go back a little bit and just tell a little bit briefly my story or tale of woe, as you will. I have been in, like you said, in the financial industry for about 25 years. I started out, my undergraduate degrees were in English and film. I'm a storyteller and I like stories. That's kind of where I came from. After a couple of years, I decided I needed to go back to school, I got an MBA in finance to make myself more useful in the world, more marketable. And I was interested in kind of the finance and the numbers behind the stories of how things worked. That got me into pursuing my CFA, and you described it already, a certificate for financial professionals. I got my CFA charter in 2003 and actually joined the CFA Institute itself in 2005 as an employee. When they started what was kind of the think tank arm of CFA Institute. It was called the Center for Financial Market Integrity. And we fought the good fight for fair markets and shareowner rights and those kind of things. Right about that time, 2005, in fact, my first assignment at CFA Institute was to be part of the meetings that led to the PRI, Principles of Responsible Investment. That they started those meetings in 2005, and I think the PRI officially launched in 2006. So it'll be 20 years next year, 20 years ago next year. And so my career from then really followed the ESG sustainability path. And I did research and writing and speaking on sustainability issues throughout the years. And, I thought that sustainability and ESG was the way to go to integrate environmental, social, and governance information into the investment process would get us better outcomes, would protect the environment and make sure we're operating businesses in a sustainable way. And there wasn't really one moment where a light bulb above my head dinged. But over time and through my research, I realized that what sustainability was in the financial world really wasn't adequate for the problems we were facing: climate change and ecological overshoot. And that gets me back to the book that was written over 50 years ago, Limits to Growth, from the Club of Rome. It was a bunch of MIT scientists. And I didn't come across this till much later, but it was written over 50 years ago, ironically, right around the time I was born. And what they surmised was through their research that the way we are living and consuming resources and consuming the Earth's resources and not regenerating those resources fast enough, our civilization is headed for some sort of collapse this century. They were speculating about the middle of the century based on what we've seen happen in other societies, and our way of living wasn't really sustainable. The economics we used didn't really account very well for the energy we put into a system and the waste that comes out of that system. And that our culture and our economics had really set us up uh, for pursuing growth is kind of the end, the end, our purpose. Our purpose was to grow economies. CEOs and politicians are fired, if you will, if they don't provide growth and they promise growth. But this promise for growth is really a relatively new thing in humanity's history. It goes back to the 1930s when an economist in the U.S., Simon Kuznets, was assigned a better way to measure our economies and how our economies are doing. And he came up with GDP, which is just aggregating everything we do in an economy. And he actually warned not to use GDP as a way to measure well-being in an economy. But of course, eventually that's what we did. And here today, you look at politicians talking, leaders talking, growth of the economy is what we're told is how we succeed. Now that's fine if we were on a planet with limited resources, but of course we're not. And of course, the waste we produce from that growth is carbon dioxide and plastics and deforestation is part of that, and spoiling our water systems is part of that. And a good way to see that this is happening is, and I know I've been talking for a while, but this is kind of setting things up, is the planetary boundaries framework, which I advise people to look at. This was started in 2009 by some scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And what it is it tracks the 9 planetary boundaries, which are really the natural systems that are our life support system. Climate is just one of those. Land use, primarily deforestation is another, and water use and novel entities, novel being, it's mostly plastics, things that shouldn't be in the environment. And 7 of those 9 planetary boundaries have now passed into the red, if you will, into the danger zone, if you will. And so what that means is we are destroying the natural systems that keep us alive in order to grow. And of course, that's not good. That's not sound math in the long run. And so what we need to do is find a way to not focus on growth as much, not have our economies not have our economies focused on growth so much, so we can settle into a steady state economy that's within those planetary boundaries. Now that will mean cutting back on some industries. Some industries will shrink, some industries will grow, and that's setting things up how we get to and how I got to understanding that we needed to degrow. We need to enter a post-growth economy. And it's not a matter of ideology. It's really a matter of survival in the long run.
From some of your writings, I've read that you see ecological economics as being very different from classical economics, and yet I've seen, and many of our listeners have seen, attempts to use conventional economics to look at bring in the dependencies on nature, to put financial numbers on some of all of that, to do scenario planning around climate and to put financial figures on that. We've seen the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TNFD, which we had a
Right.
previous whole podcast about.
Yeah.
And so there's been that attempt to marry classical economics with an understanding of dependence on nature, planetary boundaries being an aspect of that. In what way are you saying that isn't working or can't work, and that a different type of ecological economics is needed? Explain that.
I think all of those things are useful. You know, pricing carbon is useful. It's a market mechanism that puts a price on carbon. Uh, you ultimately use less of that carbon or find better ways to use it that aren't as polluting. But as long as growth is our mandate, we're going to find ways to grow, or we're incentivized to find ways to grow. I think the work of the TNFD and the CSR and all those things are good tools to use, but we fundamentally aren't managing our economies within the planetary boundaries. I'm a co-founder of our Arketa Institute. We're a think tank focused on ecological economics and degrowth, or getting to a post-growth world. We came out with a report in April of this year, and we kind of break this down. And I encourage people to read it. We tried to make it as plain language as we could. Um, but you get down to it, it's just physics and chemistry. There are limits that the laws of thermodynamics put on us that we can't negotiate away. You know, being more transparent about using more energy doesn't mean you stop using more energy. The flaw of neoclassical economics, the economics that we all generally use today, is that it doesn't really account for the energy we need to use, and the harm it's doing, and the waste that comes from it. So, there's a throughout history, starting from the Industrial Revolution. I mean, before that, but we really see this from the Industrial Revolution. Any new energy source we use doesn't replace the energy source before it. It just adds to the energy we use. And there's a great thing called Jevons Paradox that we talk about in our paper, and you can find it many places. But Jevons was an economist back when we were using coal, and he was in England or Scotland. Um, and he realized that if we have, the steam engine was a more efficient way to use coal. And so it was much more efficient than what we had before. We ended up using more coal because there was more ways to use coal. Energy efficiency in our cars doesn't mean we use less gas. It means we use more because we can get more out of it. And so energy efficiency, is one answer to these problems, and green growth is one answer to these problems, aren't sufficient. Yes, we should green our energy sources as much as we can, but any wind turbine, any solar panel still has carbon in its production. And so, yes, we should switch to those, but you also have to cut back on the materials you're using. You also have to cut back on the waste you're producing. And people may say, well, we can have a circular economy. We can just reuse things. That's true to some extent, but the circular economy now only makes up about 8% of the materials we use. You can only recycle so much.
I want to put some of the counter arguments to you so our audience can hear your
Please do.
response. And one is the argument for green growth. I think you've started to answer that already. So I'd like you to clarify it a bit further. There are some that say that we can have growth and that huge investment in electrification, in the transition to fossil fuels, in industry being transitioned towards low energy production methods, that all of that can be consistent with growth, but it's a forced green growth. You've begun to say you doubt that. Just give us a few more arguments about why you don't think that's right.
Yeah. No, I would encourage people to look at our paper and others who've written about this, because we're only talking for, a couple minutes, but you can find much more about it there and other places. Jevons Paradox is part of that. When we use energy more efficiently, we just use more of it. So if you have more energy from wind or from solar or from geothermal, you're going to use more of it. So you're going to need more solar panels. You're going to need more wind turbines. You need more geothermal energy, and so on. And all that has a footprint in of itself. Yes, it's less than oil and gas, but it's still there. And the more of us there are, the more we're using all these resources. That math just doesn't work in the end. There's a great graphic in our international energy, or international, the IEA had a great report on this a couple years ago. And you can find this information in many other places as well. But the decoupling of economic growth from energy use it's not really there. It's been decoupled a bit, but very slightly. And what often happens is in developed markets, the energy in the UK or the US or Canada or France or wherever it is, the energy, the decoupling of energy from growth happens a bit, but that's often because energy is outsourced somewhere else. Things are produced in India or China where a lot of coal is used. And so, yes, the energy, the growth is decoupled from energy somewhat, but only slightly. And the materials use isn't decoupled at all. And so materials use is another part of this that people often forget. It's not just energy. It's that timber or that iron ore or that copper. And so you have to, in our argument, and again, our argument is if this was a problem 500 years from now that we saw coming, we would have plenty of time to adjust, make small changes now, and those would add up over time. But we don't. It's already here. We've already passed 7 of those 9 planetary boundaries. So we have to take action such as degrowth, as moving to a post-growth economy, because it's our life support system that we're talking about, that we're making it harder for our life support system to work.
Can I just pick up on that issue of
Sure,
decoupling
sure.
growth from emissions? I've heard what you've said, but there are lots of people and everyone, a lot of people listening are involved in net zero, and the whole premise of net zero is that we can decouple. And there are people who say limits to growth wasn't right. If you go back in history, Malthus said that the world population had to be curtailed because there were limits to how far we could feed people. And he was proven wrong because technological change came in. We've got rid of the problem with the ozone layer by technological change. We've got rid of a lot of the acid rain in the world through technological change. Granted, it's urgent. Granted, some of that technology doesn't exist today, but why can't we imagine a pathway in which technological change does enable growth to be decoupled from emissions? We've got it wrong in the past, and maybe we're getting it wrong now. How do you respond to that?
Just that math doesn't work. I'm sorry. Is my response to people, and it gets back. It's physics and chemistry. It's the laws of thermodynamics. It's like there's only so much that. There's a great. I forget who said it. I wish I could remember who said it, but there's a great way to kind of sum up the laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics says, um, there's only so much energy in the universe. We're not making any more. The second law of thermodynamics says that every system moves towards entropy. And all that means is the energy dissipates. The classic example is a cup of coffee, a hot cup of coffee on the table that you're drinking. If you let it sit for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it will get cooler. That energy dissipates. In order to make it hot again, you have to add work to that. You have to add energy to that to make it hot again. And so there's no, there's a finite amount of energy in the universe on Earth. Generally, we could mine, asteroids or things like that. But that takes a lot of energy as well. And the systems, none of the systems are 100% efficient. There's always entropy in the equation. Electric engines are more efficient than internal combustion engines. And to get back to Malthus, Malthus is a great example. But Malthus was before a lot of revolutions in medicine, in that allowed people to live longer, and the revolution in energy, which let us get a lot more out of work to produce much more corn and much more soy and much more everything than we needed. The limits that he couldn't imagine were overcome by science and the use of fossil fuels and other energy resources. But there's nothing on the other side of this conversation that's going to make the limits to our growth go away, that's going to make the planetary boundaries go away. In order to cut back, to get back in the safe zone on climate change, we have to use less energy. Uh, Sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere doesn't work very well. It works in the very long term through plants and photosynthesis and those things, but it's been shown not to really work. And my cynical argument would be the people who are saying that what I'm saying is wrong, their businesses depend on growth. And they don't want to hear my argument that growth is a problem. And I wish I was wrong. I don't, I wish that wasn't the case. But I see the physics and chemistry can't be negotiated. The example I give is the laws of thermodynamics were the way Earth worked 65 million years ago when the asteroid hit to kill off the dinosaurs. Neoclassical economics was not around then. We invented that to make sense of the world we see and to put rules on how capital is used. But the laws of thermodynamics still govern what is and what isn't possible.
And I'm glad we're airing the argument today. I'm
Yeah,
not going to just put the counter arguments, but I'm going to put the last big one, the third one,
sure,
which
sure.
is the one of political acceptability. Now, if we were to freeze growth today, measured by purchasing power parity,
Yep.
the mean income in the world is about 17,000 US dollars, which 85% of rich countries in the global north would involve reductions in income. And for a quarter of the population in the global north would mean a two-thirds reduction in their income. How are we ever going to get people to vote for this if it's going to happen when they're going to suffer a huge reduction in their income?
That's a fantastic question and one we get all the time. And again, I wish this was a problem 500 years in the future because then that wouldn't be the conversation we need to have. But I think people, frankly speaking, people need to realize that the laws of thermodynamics are in charge. Our politics aren't in charge. Our politics can change. The laws of thermodynamics don't change. And so when people say, I don't want that, my answer is, I'm sorry. I'm not here to negotiate with. I'm just telling you what we see through science. And this gets back to you, and it's interesting you frame the question that prosperity is wealth is kind of how the question was framed. And that's a very just as growth as a reason for being as an economy is a very new concept relative in human history. Throughout our lives, through the 30s when GDP was created, and it's interesting, modern advertising was created in the 1920s, started to be created in the 1920s, and modern advertising has really over the years convinced us that our wants are the same as our needs, and that car you want, or that bigger house you want, or that vacation you want, isn't a want, it's a need, it's an essential. And of course, that's not true. We need water, we need air, we need socially, we need a sense of belonging and something bigger than ourselves. And study after study shows that after a certain level of wealth, we're no happier as people. And so that we are, as a society, chasing growth to have more wealth is a bit of a fool's errand in the long run. And look, I live in a nice place. I, for most of my life, have been on that same treadmill, getting a better education, to get a better job, to get more money, to live in a nicer place, to have more to provide for my children. But I've realized that prosperity isn't wealth. That is part of it. But prosperity is health and education and community and a sense of all of those things. And this feels kind of hippie, out there kind of thing to some people. But when you get right down to it, that's where we're headed. The name of our paper that we put out in April was By Disaster or Design. And by disaster design, a post-growth world is coming. The planetary boundaries, we can't negotiate that. The physics and chemistry, we can't negotiate that. I hear people when they say, well, people aren't going to sign up for that. They're not signing up for it, but they're being signed up for it because of the way we live. And that's just the reality of it.
Certainly, in my own experience, on different ways of measuring well-being that have been brought in
Yeah,
different countries around the world, in the idea of community wealth building. There is a body of work there
yeah,
behind this, and
yeah.
some would argue that we're on the journey. But in preparing for this conversation, I read another economist, James Medway, who would basically subscribe to what you're arguing today, but says it's a bit too utopian because to move as far as degrowth is a utopian vision, which is a
Mhm.
huge leap to get to. And it's the very nature of the crisis at the moment, the urgency, which means we can't afford to try to just redesign the whole system, however much it is needed, and that we have to find step by steps to deal with it from now on. That seemed to me a criticism of this degrowth argument from someone who was essentially sympathetic to it. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would tend to agree with him by saying that, look, this isn't going to happen on Tuesday. This isn't going to happen tomorrow. This is going to happen next month. And I totally agree that you ask people to vote for this, it will fail because the way we frame our economies and capitalism and all those things are tied up in our identities. And I push back when people say, oh, it's a utopian vision, because capitalism is a utopian vision. Socialism is a utopian vision. Everything is sold as the way to live. This is going to solve things. Capitalism is the way through. Socialism is the way through, or any other ism, right? And no, I don't think degrowth is utopian. I think some people believe that, in and outside the degrowth movement, but no vision is no way of living is utopian. You're going to have, the struggles of life, no matter what system, no matter what ism you're in. Our argument is like, look, just the physical reality of the current way we're doing things doesn't work for where we need to be as humanity. It's going to be self-destructive, and it's already starting to be self-destructive. Yes, it's not going to change tomorrow. Um, I read this great book, and I talked to the guy who wrote it. He's at the University of Houston. He's a futurist. I guess I didn't know you could be a futurist. I guess that says it on his business card. But he's I forget the name of the center. I apologize. But he's at the futurist, the center in Houston. And there's a couple of these kind of places around the world. And he wrote a book earlier this year, Reimagining After Capitalism. And it wasn't some screed about capitalism and evil and all that stuff. I don't believe that. He didn't believe that. But just he sees the system crumbling as other isms, as other systems have before. And he, this is what they study as futurists and how that's happened in the past and what comes next. And, what comes next is when a system is crumbling, when things are changing, the whole quote of, the old system is dying and a new one is struggling to be born kind of thing. I think that's the kind of a moment we're in. Maybe not today, but as time goes forward in the next couple of decades. And this book, Andy Hines is his name, and Reimagining After Capitalism's book. It's a very good book. It's very academic, but very accessible. But it's very thorough in their analysis of this issue. And what they find is that when these changes happen, people look around for what other ideas are laying around. What other ideas are there of how do we do this? And a post-growth world, an ecological, economic focused world is one of those ideas. It's not going to, no one's going to decree that this is the way we're living tomorrow. The transition from capitalism to or feudalism to capitalism and other transitions happened over very long times. There's still feudalism in the world in pockets in different ways. North Korea is a feudal society, for example. So I'm under no illusion this is going to happen tomorrow, but knowing what I know, I can't go back and put my head in the sand and say, I'm just going to pretend that there aren't any limits to growth. I'm just going to pretend that there aren't any limits to the energy we can use. I'm not going to just pretend that we don't need to cut back on the waste we use. We are trying to normalize this conversation in the financial industry and the sustainability industry because we think these conversations need to happen. I wish they happened. I wish I knew these things 30 years ago. I wish these conversations were happening 30 years ago.
Can I ask you about that? Because the Arketa Institute is advising and informing the finance industry still. You're talking to
Mhm.
finance. We've seen these perhaps more political attacks on so-called ESG investment
Mhm.
and a bit of retrenchment there. And I just wonder, what is the future of finance? How will finance change to meet the sort of vision that you're explaining?
That's a great question. And I wish I knew the answer. But I mean, I'll tell you what I think is going to happen. Maybe we'll come back in 10 years and we'll see how wrong I am over a pint. But I see finance. Well, finance has been part of the problem in that finance is I think people would be surprised to hear finance is about 20-25% of the market capitalization of the world's, stock markets. It's the biggest industry in the world. And it's gotten that way because we've over financialized things. Think about what finance does. It used to be to raise money to build that school or that hospital or your house or a freeway or a grocery store or a farm or whatever it was. Now, a lot of finance is derivatives and moving money from place A to place B and making bets on what's going to go up or down. And the the result of that is to create more wealth, which drives more growth. And to have more wealth, you have to have more growth. And to have more growth, you need to have more wealth, and so on. So it's this vicious cycle that keeps going up and up and up. And again, on a planet where with finite resources, or we had 500 years to solve this problem, that wouldn't be a problem, but it is a problem now. And so, and this gets back to the prosperity as wealth, argument that we frame and see prosperity as wealth, and nothing else. I say to kind of visualize it like we're all encouraged to be dragons sitting on ever-growing piles of gold, but that's not what makes us happy. That's not what our purpose is. That's self-destructive in the long run. So the way how I see finance changing is that, again, it gets to by disaster design, the world is going to change. The world is going to get to be focused more on slower growth. Growth, and a good way to look at it is I like the term agrowth, agnostic to growth. Things will grow, but growth isn't our pursuit. Growth isn't our goal. Some industries, health, education will grow. Others, oil and gas mining may go down. But what I see finance getting back to in the longer run is financing more things physical things on the ground that are local. I think over time we will move back to things happening more community based and local based. Like an example I give is, you know, I have kids, they love eating grapes, but in February, the grapes I get are from Chile. They're flown from Chile all the way to the United States. We don't need to do that. We can eat seasonally. We've done it for, hundreds of thousands, well, not hundreds, tens of thousands of years. Uh, and so moving back towards agriculture and culture and a lot of other things are provided more locally and financed more locally. And I think finance is one of those industries that will shrink because as we step off, realize we have to step off or do step off the growth treadmill that we're on, we won't need to finance that growth that leads to that wealth. And this is a whole different podcast probably, but that gets into the issue of inequality. You know, we're at a level of inequality that hasn't been seen since the 1920s or before that, the French Revolution and the revolutions all throughout Europe, and those cycles of great wealth accumulation and concentration and destruction happen because the wealth is concentrated. There's revolutions because once you get only a couple of people holding all the wealth, that becomes a problem. And so the issue of inequality gets back into, well, what is prosperity? Prosperity, as it's just wealth, that's the kind of system you get to. But if prosperity is community and health and education and wealth, but all of those things and a well-being life, then those things aren't as much of a problem.
I'm thinking of those chief sustainability officers and sustainability teams in businesses that are listening to this. And I know they're thinking, what the hell do I say in my company? We've got to
I
make
know.
less profits. We've got to shrink. What's your message to them?
I get it. I know that that's a hard thing to hear, but it's the harsh truth. It's reality. The physics and chemistry aren't negotiable. And in the paper we wrote in April, the first part was laying out this is what ecological economics is, this is what degrowth is, this is what systems thinking is. The second part was, okay, what does this mean for finance? Because our target is finance, because finance is such a big part of the world, and we're focusing on that to help change things. But the third part of the paper is kind of holding people's hands. Like, we know this is a huge cultural change. This is an identity change. I I guess I don't call myself a capitalist, but I am. I live in a capitalist society. I work to get money to pay for things. This is how the world works. I understand that this is scary for people, and I'm challenging, not just me, but we're challenging norms of the way the world works. But we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't see a better way. It gets back to we are past the planetary boundaries on these issues. We have to do something like this. And yes, green all the energy you can, but that's not going to be enough. And try to, not physically, but we need to look ourselves in the mirror as a society and see, is this wealth accumulation our reason for being as individuals in a society? And the answer is no. And it gets, and that's hard to say because it would be a change of the way things are done. And I know professionals in finance, professionals, sustainability is, sustainability professionals, because I've been one. I am, this is the things that I have been and am. I've been in that world, and I know that what we're doing is challenging that, and I expect to get a lot of pushback. I accept it and I anticipate it, but just the laws of physics uh, can't be negotiated with, and we do so and ignore them at our peril. And so learn about, and I would say to those people in finance and sustainability, don't take what I say in this half an hour you and I are talking as gospel. Go out and find out for yourself. Learn these things for yourself. And it may be uncomfortable what you find. An analog I use is kind of the 7 stages of grief. That you start off at denial, uh, and you get to acceptance in the end. And there's a lot of juicy stuff in the middle, bargaining and anger and all those things. And I've gone through that journey. When I started coming across these things, I was like, oh, this can't be true. I don't believe that. But I'm in acceptance now because I've gone through that journey. And I invite people to go through whatever journey they need to go on, but do go on that journey, because otherwise we're sticking our heads in the sand and just pretending the problem isn't a problem.
Just want to ask you a very quick question. I'm sorry, we've only got time for a quick answer. But when we
Sure.
spoke before about this, you talked about imagination being a key resource, and I just wanted to give you a chance to expand that argument.
Yeah, I think that has served me well as someone, as I said in the beginning, like I came out of university an English major and a film major. I joke that by having 2 useless degrees, I thought I had at least one useful degree in total. But they're not useless because I love stories. Stories are the way we make sense of the world and the way we define who we are. And so I come at anything as from a storyteller. I understand the finance of everything. I can do the balance sheet and income statement, all that stuff. Uh, but to see a better future, you have to be able to imagine a better future. And so part of the part of the problem is that cultural change, that challenging of identity is so much of us live in a world of wealth is the reason for being, wealth accumulation is the reason for being. GDP growth is the reason for our economies to be. Um, and to imagine a different way of living, imagine a different way of defining ourselves is insanely important in this conversation. If we can't imagine the world being any different, it won't be any different. Well, it will change. We can get to the by disaster part of things, but to design a better world, and it's not going to be just me and just degrowth, just ecological economics. The historians will define this period, long after we're gone. But if we don't have imagination about what can be, then we're lost. And so I think imagining imagining a different way of doing things and a better way of doing things is where to start. And again, I encourage people to take that journey, start that journey, and find and there's many. I encourage people to bother me on LinkedIn and other places if they want to talk to me. But there's tons of great resources out there about ecological economics and post growth and a lot of these issues that I encourage people to go explore on their own and use their imaginations.
In this podcast, Matt has talked to us about Jevons Paradox and a lot of the efforts towards the transition to a green economy may actually be paradoxical in terms of actually the the aims in mind. He's talked more than once about not being able to break the laws of thermodynamics and having to confront the reality of what that means. He's argued that we can decouple, but decouple wants from needs. He's seen a future for the economy and for finance being much more locally based. He's talked about almost thinking about grief in terms of how we address these issues. And in that last answer, he's talked about the importance of imagination in order to empower us to do so. By Disaster or Design is written by the Arketa Institute, apologies, and is available on their website. And to Matt Orsagh, I'd like to say thank you very, very much for the time we spent together today.
Thank you, Richard. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our LinkedIn page, where you can give us your feedback, and also you can do that via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share this conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And don't forget that you can watch the podcast now on our YouTube channel too. This is the last podcast of 2025. Thank you to all our listeners. If you're about to embark on a holiday, we send the very best wishes, and we look forward to returning with our first podcast at the start of the new year, 2026. Thank you again to Matt, to all our listeners, and goodbye.